Oh, take me back to the start.
So we've been in this series called Back to the Start. It's a series where we've been digging through the book of Genesis. And in the book of Genesis, we've been finding out how God created the universe to begin with and how it all went bad and what God's trying to do to solve the problem. Back in Genesis chapter 3, God made a promise to the first human beings, Adam and Eve. And he said to Eve, I'm promising that one of these days you're going to have a son, and that son is going to grow up and he's going to crush the power of evil. Now that sounds awesome. But Eve's first son murdered her second son. So clearly it wasn't one of those two guys. And so then God says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to start fresh. We're going to start out with Seth. He's the next son to be born. And so now they're thinking, okay, Seth is the guy. He's the promised one. And it didn't turn out so well. And then the people went bad again, and God had to reboot everything with Noah. You saw the movie. You know, the rains came down, and the ark floated, and all that stuff. And everybody died except Noah and his family. And God said, okay, we're going to reboot this thing. We're going to start over because I promised a son who would crush the forces of evil. Now we've got Noah, righteous man, let him do it. Well, things didn't last all that well. They tried to build a tower and tried to make a name for themselves when God said, no, I want you to spread out over all the earth. And they said, no, we want to make a name for ourselves. And so God says, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to spread your languages around. And so now that you can't understand each other, you're going to have to physically spread out throughout the rest of the world. And so he rebooted everything kind of again by kicking everybody away from the tower and making them go to different places. And then finally we come to a guy named Abraham. And with Abraham, the second chance reboot thing doesn't happen. God changes it up because he knows that just giving humanity a second chance isn't good enough. Every time he's told them, listen, I'm making a promise to you, they mess it up. So he changed the promise. And this time to Abraham, instead of making a promise that one of these days someone would come to crush the powers of evil, he made the promise to Abraham, right now, you are going to receive my blessings just because I'm going to dump it on you, and it's going to hit. And so you're going to receive my blessings, and then you will be a blessing to the rest of the world. God changed it up. He made it more positive rather than negative. It wasn't just against evil. Now it was for good. And he was making a promise to Abraham. Okay, Abraham, here's the deal. I'm making the promise to you. And the very next thing that happens is Abraham goes down to Egypt and he sells his wife to Pharaoh, almost like he's prostituting her out. And we read the story and we're like, what? This is not a good man. This guy is creepy. God, give up on him. Reboot again. Start over. Flood something. And he doesn't. In fact, we see time and time again that Abraham has ups and he has downs. And he has ups. God speaks to him and he has ups. And he does what God says, and it's great. And then he has downs. And it's in those down moments that when we think, man, God, you should just give up on the guy. He's clearly hopeless. And God speaks to him. And God comes back to him. And God says the promise again. And time again, Abraham proves to us that even though he fails over and over, God doesn't. God keeps his promise. Problem, though, is that Abraham's dying. He's old. His wife is dead. His son now has a wife. We learned that last week. And it's time for the son to carry the mantle of this promise. And the question, is Isaac good enough? Is he going to be able to maintain this promise? Is he worth the promise? Is God going to keep it up for Isaac? And that's where we come to today. And so we're going to start by finishing out the story of Abraham. So if you have your Bibles, flip to Genesis 25. We're going to finish out the story of Abraham and learn just a couple final things about him. I'm going to give you a comment that's sort of an aside comment, and then we're going to get into the story of Isaac. Here we go. Genesis 25, verse 1. Abraham had taken another wife whose name was Keturah. Hold on there just a second. It's hard for us to translate the verbs here. One way of translating it is the way it's written here in the modern version of the NIV. Abraham had taken another wife. Another way of translating it is Abraham took another wife. And so the problem is, do we understand that this new wife has come after Sarah has died? Or is it possible that he married this new wife before Sarah died? As a matter of fact, we learned last week that when Abraham found out Sarah was dead, he wasn't living in her house. He had to go travel to where she was to bury her. It's possible that for the 30 years after Isaac was born until Sarah died, it's possible that Abraham took another wife and started another family. And we say to ourselves, man, can this guy not get it all right? Is it possible that he could have just stayed faithful? Now, we don't know. It's speculating. Maybe honorable Abraham waited until Sarah died before he took Keturah. And after Sarah died, he lived for 40 more years. So it's possible he had all these children. We don't know. All we know is Abraham was a normal dude. Okay? A normal guy. And God put up with him. Maybe there's hope for any of us. Let's keep going. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan was the father of Sheba and Dedan. The descendants of Dedan were the Asherites, the Letushites, and the Leumites. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldah. All these were descendants of Keturah. Don't you just love Genesis names? And once again, we get a list of names. And that's not the only one. We're going to get another list of names in just a couple minutes. But here we get another list of names. And remember, what's the deal when you get a list of names? What's the beginning? What's the end? And what happens in the middle? In the beginning and the end, we get one name repeated. It's Keturah. It's letting us know that this is all happening because of Keturah, the second wife, the other wife, the after Sarah wife. That's important. Because what's in the middle of it is a whole list of names that you and I don't recognize, but the people who first read this book would have. When Moses writes these names down, remember he is talking to a group that's just come out of Egypt. These Israelites, they're trying to figure out what does it mean to be God's people in this world. They have just left Egypt, now they're becoming their own thing. They know that they're the descendants of Isaac. They know that much. And so the question that they have now is, what does it mean for us to live in this land with all these other people who are here? What does it mean for us to be the Israelites, God's chosen people? And what Moses is writing down here is something to remind us. They knew all these names as nations. Nations like Midian that they would later be fighting. Nations like Sheba, who would later send a queen to talk to Solomon, who was the wealthiest man and wisest man in the world. They knew these nations. They knew these names. What they didn't know is that they were their brothers. What they didn't know is that they were family. You see, these names are listed here to let us know that the ancient Israelites were the same family as all the other people who lived back there. They were the same family. They all came from Abraham. And what further we should know is that when Abraham took another wife, God kept his promise to Abraham and made that relationship fruitful. An amazing situation, even though he might have taken this wife before Sarah was totally dead. Even though that's possible, God still blessed it. Let's keep reading. See what else happens here. Verse 5. Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac. But while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. This is also important because, see, the people of Israel are thinking, we're the chosen ones. Isaac was the chosen one. Isaac was the son of the promise. He's the chosen one, right? So that means we're the chosen ones. But here this passage is trying to remind them, just because you're the chosen ones doesn't mean you're better. You're just brothers and sisters. See, check this out. Why does Isaac get all of the inheritance? Well, because he's the chosen one, duh. Why do the other people get gifts? Because Abraham is acknowledging that they deserve to be honored too. They aren't afterthoughts. They aren't secondary. They deserve to be honored. And oh, by the way, if Isaac is the chosen one, what is he chosen to do or to be? You remember the promise. God said to Abraham, I will bless you so you will be a blessing. In other words, if Isaac is going to be the guy who blesses everybody, then he has to be the guy who has blessings. He has to be the guy who has the stuff to give. You know, Spider-Man's uncle was right. With great power comes great responsibility. But we'll flip it and we'll say with great responsibility comes great blessings. In other words, he already had the responsibility to carry on this promise. So Abraham says, I'm going to give you everything I got. And here's your job, to be a blessing. What does that teach us, and what does it teach the ancient Israelites? Just because you're chosen doesn't mean you're special. It just means you have a job to do. It just means you have a job to be the blessing. Sure, I'll bless you, but it's not for you. And this is a hard thing for Christians. Do you realize that the blessings you've been given are not for you? Do you realize that the wealth you've been given wasn't given for you? Do you realize the intellect, the skills, the talents, the gifts, it's not for you? You have what you have because you're called. You have what you have because you're part of the chosen people. You have what you have because there's a job to do, and God needed someone to do that job, and He thought you were a good candidate, so He gave you what He gave you so you could do what you're supposed to do. And here's the first thing I want you to jot down. Isaac, this is like an aside, issues on prejudice, but it plays into our hands too because we need to know it. Isaac receives a greater blessing just because he has a greater responsibility. That's it. He's the chosen one. That's why he gets the greater blessing. Now, as we read through the rest of what happens here at the end of Abraham's life, there's just a couple little things I'll comment on, but then we'll get into the Isaac story, okay? Abraham lived, verse 7, 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years. How many times does it have to tell us he was old? It's because it was significant. He lived like 40 years longer than most people lived. It's clearly that he was under the hand of God's blessing. Amazing. Good old age, an old man full of years, and he was gathered to his people. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, the field Abraham had bought from the Hittites. There, Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahairoi. It's wonderful to know that at the end of his life, when he was buried, Isaac and Ishmael came together for their dad to bury him. I don't know if they buried their hatchet too, or if they just buried the dad, but they came together, and there in that place, they buried him with Sarah, his first wife, the wife of the promise. And there he lay in a cave he rightfully owned in the land of promise, as more of a symbol that this is our land. It's just a good thing for us to remember that this text is continuing to remind us of that. But now let's keep going. Because what happens next is after Isaac gets the blessing, we now learn about Ishmael. Verse 12. This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Ishmael, whom Sarah's slave Hagar the Egyptian bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael. Get ready, here's some names. Listed in the order of their birth: Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. Were you counting? These were the sons of Ishmael, and these are the names of the 12 tribal rulers according to their settlements and camps. Why would 12 be important at all? I don't think you were counting because I wasn't counting, but it was 12. Why would that be important? Remember this. The people of Israel have just come out of Egypt, and they're in 12 tribes. They know it. They know they're in 12 different tribes. And they view themselves as the 12 tribes of Israel. They use that phrase to refer to themselves as God's chosen people. God's chosen people. We're the 12 tribes. When Jesus chose his disciples, he picked 12 of them. 12 was their number. They believed it was the number that God chose us. Ishmael had 12 sons. These guys are coming into the land, and they need to know that they are brothers and sisters with the other people who live there. And they need to know that just because God chose them doesn't mean God's not involved with them, with the other people. But check this out. There's one thing that happens here at the end. These 12 sons. Ishmael lived 137 years. He breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his people. His descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt, as you go toward Ashur, and they lived in hostility toward all the tribes related to them. And that last little piece sets something up for us. You might know this already, but when they entered the promised land, the Israelites were supposed to eradicate the people who were already there. They were supposed to wipe them out. And there's a part of us that could look at that story and we could say God's prejudicial. He chose the Israelites. He liked the Israelites. He wanted the Israelites. He wanted to kick all these other people out. The Israelites could have also seen it in a prejudicial light. And they could have also said, God chose us. He wants to kick these other people out. He likes us. He doesn't like them. Don't believe it. That's not the truth. What this passage sets up for us is the knowledge that these other nations were all siblings. They were all part of God's plan. God was working in their lives too, but they had chosen a pathway of hostility, and they had chosen a pathway of violence. And that's what sets up the book of Judges to be a book of judgment that they were supposed to be giving on all these other nations that were living there. See, it's not that God liked Israel more. It's that God made a promise to them, and they were supposed to be the ones he would use, and this is one of the ways he wanted to use them to bring judgment to the people who were walking in violence. Now, with all that said, it's time for us to get to Isaac. Okay, and I know we're running out of time. I don't care about that. So with all that said, we're talking about Isaac now, and Isaac is a complicated story because of this. As we read this story today, it's going to sound familiar to you. You're going to be like, wait a minute, didn't I read that sometime before? And the answer is yes. And yet, this is the only thing we get about Isaac is what we're reading today. The only stories we get about Isaac are what we're reading today. So let's go ahead and see what happens. Chapter 26. It's wrong on the screen. It's chapter 26. No, that's right on the screen. Sorry, chapter 25, 19 is where the verse we're starting at. This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son, Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac. And Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Paddan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. We later find out that she gave birth when Isaac was 60 years old, which meant they were married for 20 years while she could not have a child. We have just learned about a woman who can't have a child, but yet God somehow miraculously makes her pregnant. Does that sound familiar to you? Well, if you've been hanging out with us for the past few chapters in Genesis, it should. It was just like Abraham, Isaac's dad. In fact, the rest of this story has tons of parallels between Isaac and Abraham. Let me just share with you a little chart about some of the similarities. Here's Isaac. Isaac's wife is barren. Later on, he has 2 sons, and those sons are rivals. Later on, he encounters a guy named Abimelech. Later on, Rebekah schemes to get her favorite son more favor. And then finally, Isaac sends that son to go get a wife. Sounds fascinating because it already happened with Abraham. Check out Abraham. Abraham's wife was also barren. Abraham encountered a guy named Abimelech. Abraham's sons were rivals. Sarah, his wife, schemed for her favorite son, and Abraham sends off a servant to get a wife for his favorite son. Now, here's a fascinating thing. It's like father, like son. I thought I'd show you a little video clip of my dad. The sound is loud, so you guys might want to adjust it. But this is my dad preaching last Sunday in his church in Southern California. Here you go.
Paul is not giving us anything that is incredibly hard to understand. It's not higher math. He's really going to give us the 2 + 2 = 4s of the Christian life.
My dad's doing math. It's very, very simple math, but that's okay. So anyway, I'm showing that to you because, sometimes I do motions that my dad does. And sometimes I have like patterns of speech that my dad might have. And my wife has made fun of me for something I used to do that I don't do anymore, but it would be just going up on my toes. And if you watch 6 of his sermons, you'll see him do it 100,000 times. And sometimes I laugh, and it's my dad's laugh that's coming out. And sometimes, I look at myself and I say, man, that's a good thing about me that I like, but it's really from my dad. And then there's a bad thing that I like, and that's not from my dad. And it's a whole jumble of mess, You're like that too. I know you've got dad and mom issues. Every one of us does. But here's the situation. It doesn't matter how much like my dad I am. What matters is Isaac. Is he good enough for the promise? Is he going to be good enough for the promise? I mean, his story kind of looks like his dad. But let's see what other similarities we find. Let's go ahead and look. Here we are in chapter 26, verse 1, and this is the only story we get about Isaac, and you'll have to figure out, how much is fresh and new information here. Now there was a famine in the land, besides the previous famine in Abraham's time. Oh, there it is, right there. He's already telling us that Isaac had a famine, just like his dad had a famine. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines in Gerar. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt." Why would he say don't go down to Egypt? Because his dad went down to Egypt after a famine. "Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions." So Isaac stayed in Gerar. When the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, "She's my sister," because he was afraid to say she's my wife. He thought the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah because she is beautiful. When Isaac had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down from a window and saw Isaac caressing his wife Rebekah. I don't know how that happened, but I'm just going with it. So Abimelech summoned Isaac and said, "She's really your wife? Why did you say she's my sister?" Isaac answered him, "Because I thought I might lose my life on account of her." Then Abimelech said, "What is this you've done to us? One of the men might well have slept with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech gave orders to all the people, "Anyone who harms this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." Does this sound familiar to you at all? Like 3 weeks ago we were there. What's this all? Okay, well, let's just see what happens next. Okay, let's keep reading through the story, see what happens next. Because the next thing is you find God making a promise to someone in a desert. We'll see what goes on. Verse 12, Isaac planted crops in that land, and that same year reaped 100-fold, because the Lord blessed him. The man became rich, and his wealth continued to grow until he became very wealthy. He had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. So all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the time of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up, filling them with earth. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, "Move away from us. You've become too powerful for us." So here's a rivalry, and people say, "We want you to leave us. We're going to kick you out of this land. You go to the desert." So Isaac moved away from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar, where he settled. Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham, which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham died, and he gave them the same names his father had given them. Isaac's servants dug in the valley and discovered a well of fresh water there. But the herders of Gerar quarreled with those of Isaac and said, "The water's ours." So he named the well Esek, because they disputed with him. Then they dug another well, but they quarreled over that one also, so he named it Sitnah. He moved on from there and dug another well, and no one quarreled over it. He named it Rehoboth, saying, "Now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land." From there, he went up to Beersheba, a name that should be familiar to some of you by now. That night, the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. There he pitched his tent, and there his servants dug a well. We've got a man encountering God in a town called Beersheba where there's a well. Sounds familiar? Let's go on. Here's the rest of the story. Meanwhile, verse 26, Abimelech had come to him from Gerar with Ahuzath, his personal advisor, and Phicol, the commander of his forces. Isaac asked them, "Why have you come to me, since you were hostile to me and sent me away?" They answered, "We saw clearly that the Lord was with you, so we said, there ought to be a sworn agreement between us and you. Let us make a treaty with you that you will do us no harm, just as we did not harm you, but always treated you well and sent you away peacefully. And now you are blessed by the Lord." Isaac then made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. Early the next morning, the men swore an oath to each other. Then Isaac sent them on their way, and they went away peacefully. That day, Isaac's servants came and told him about the well they had dug. They said, "We've found water." He called it Sheba, and to this day, the name of the town has been Beersheba. Beersheba means well of the oath. Sheba means oath or 7. And we've already read it. It happened to Abraham. Let me show you the chart. Here's a famine that happens, and Isaac goes to Gerar. Let's put the Abraham side up next to it. Abraham had a famine and he went to Egypt. A different time Abraham went to Gerar, and when Abraham was in Gerar, he met a guy named Abimelech. Isaac meets a guy named Abimelech. By the way, some people have seen these stories as being so similar that they think it's really just one story. And one tradition says it's Isaac, and one tradition says it's Abraham. But there's so many differences, and there's so many identification points, like the whole well situation, wells being stolen, multiple wells being stolen. That doesn't happen with Abraham. Or the whole idea that the Isaac story refers to the Abraham story. But Abimelech, what do you do with a guy who's now like, it's the king, same name, but it's like 60 years later? How do you deal with that one? Well, that's okay, because Abimelech really is a title anyway. The word Abimelech means my father's the king, or my father the king, or something along those lines. Abi means father, and Melech means king. So literally, it means my father's the king. Any number of kings could have used that title as their name. Same thing goes with Phicol, the commander. Any number of commanders could have used that as their title. It's just coincidence, fascinating, interesting. They're both named Abimelech. Isaac lies about his wife. Abraham lies about his wife. Abimelech defends Isaac. Abimelech defends Abraham. Envy prompts Isaac's exile. Well, that's okay, because before, envy prompted an exile for a woman named Hagar and her son named Ishmael. Here, you got God meeting Isaac in the middle of the wilderness, and he promises a blessing. Well, God met Hagar in the middle of the wilderness and promised a blessing. We've got Isaac making an oath with Abimelech, and we've got Abraham making an oath with Abimelech. We've got Isaac naming a well Beersheba, and we've got Abraham naming a well Beersheba. Like father, like son. Now, the fascinating thing about this is that Isaac's story is almost exactly parallel to things we've already seen in Abraham's story. Why is that important? Because the people of Israel need to know that the promise didn't die. When Abraham died, the promise didn't die. When Abraham died, the promise was carried on. And Isaac is just like his dad. There are at least 3 ways that Isaac is like his dad. Go ahead and write these down. Number 1, Isaac is just like his dad. He is deceptive. This is going to come back and bite Isaac in the rear again. When we get to the story next week of Jacob and Esau, you're going to see how deception plays a sickening role in this family, time and time again. It started with Abraham. It's continuing with Isaac. Like father, like son, he is deceptive. Number 2, like father, like son, he is sometimes noble. He's sometimes noble. You see, these people were stealing the wells, and he didn't fight back. He just moved on. They said, get out of here. We don't want you to be here. He said, okay, fine, whatever. I'll just move on. God will bless me wherever I am. He's sometimes noble. But more important than that, even though he's sometimes bad and he's sometimes good, more important than that, he is just like his dad in that he is blessed anyway. He is blessed anyway. See, the story of Isaac is all about one thing. The point the Bible is making when it puts the story of Isaac in there is all about one thing, and that one thing is to try to prove to us time and time again that God is always faithful to his promises. Isaac is always proof that God is faithful to keep his promises. When Isaac was, before he was born, he was a promise, and then he was born, so there's Isaac, and he is proof that God is faithful to keep his promises. Listen, no matter how messed up you are, and no matter how backwards you've lived your life, God is faithful to keep his promises. You can trust him. There's one last thing I want to say as we close out our time today. And it's this last week in your core group, some of you were part of a core group, I know. And the final question on the core group referred to Galatians 3, verse 29. I want to read to you a few of the verses leading up to 29 because it has direct relevance to us today. Remember that no matter how he lived, God had made a promise to Isaac and he was going to keep it. Let's see what it says when we come to the New Testament in Galatians. Paul writes this in Galatians chapter 3, verse 26, beginning. It says, "So in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ." What he's saying there is that if you're connected to Jesus, then you are a child of God through faith. Jesus dies on the cross, and if you put your faith into that, then God labels you a child, a son, a daughter. That means that you are in the same position as Isaac. Check it out. It says this, "There's neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus." If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. That means you and I are Isaac. You and I are Isaac. If we're connected with Jesus, if our faith is in Jesus, then we are Isaac. We exist as one more proof of how faithful God is. We've been adopted into the family, and it's not because we're better. It's because we've been chosen for a purpose. On the night Jesus was betrayed, he revealed his purpose to his followers. Sitting around a table, he picked up some bread and he said, "This bread is my body, which is broken for you. Eat it in remembrance of me." After dinner, he took a cup and he said, "This cup is the new promise God is making to you through my blood. Drink it in remembrance of me." Jesus at that moment reveals to his followers that his purpose was to die so that we could be brought into the covenant promise God had given to Abraham, but now made much better because it includes all of us. When we come to these tables today, we come remembering that we're part of a family that is under a promise, whether we're living the right way or not. We've got our ups and we've got our downs. We've been deceptive. We've been noble, but it doesn't matter because God has chosen to bless you anyway. If you've given your heart to Jesus, come and join us for this moment and this symbolic meal, and enter into a moment of gratitude for all the blessings your God has given to you.
Thank you for listening to this message from Lafayette Community Church. We believe that God has a full and fulfilling life in store for you, and we want to help you live it. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, Pastor Jeff, through the web form at LafayetteCommunityChurch.com. And as always, I encourage you to plug into a solid, God-honoring community wherever you may be. Life is a journey, and no one should ever walk alone.